My name is Robert Callahan. I am 71 years old. I built 3 businesses from nothing, raised 2 sons with my bare hands, and buried my wife of 44 years on a Tuesday morning in November while the leaves were still falling off the oak tree she planted in our backyard the year we moved in. I have never asked anyone for anything in my life. But last spring, I stood in the hallway outside my own kitchen, in the house I paid for, in the city I never left because my family was here, and I heard my eldest son, Daniel, lower his voice to a whisper and say to his wife, "The doctor said Dad has maybe 3 months. We need to start figuring out the house situation." I stood there for a long moment. Long enough to hear her respond. Long enough to hear what she said next. And I want to tell you, I have been through a lot in 71 years. I have been through bankruptcy and recovery. I have been through the death of a child, our first, a girl, born still in 1979, a grief that never fully closes. I have been through my wife's cancer, her remission, her return of cancer, and her final breath. But nothing, prepared me for what I heard standing in that hallway. And here is the part that will surprise you. I was not sick. Not even a little. My last physical, 3 weeks prior, had given me a clean bill of health. My doctor, a serious man named Patterson who has no bedside manner whatsoever and I love him for it, had looked at my chart, looked at me, and said, "Robert, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're in better shape than men 15 years younger." So why did my son believe I had 3 months to live? Because I told him. I made it up. I engineered the entire thing. I had a reason. And by the time this story is over, I think you'll understand why. But I also want to be honest with you, because I think too many of these stories get told as simple revenge tales, as tidy little fables where the hero is always right and the villain always gets what's coming to them. Life is not like that. What I found out over the next several weeks was not simple. It was not clean. Some of it broke my heart in ways I am still processing. Some of it restored my faith in a way I didn't expect. So sit with me. Let me tell you the whole thing. From the beginning. Welcome back to the channel. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to play it straight. They just chose the hard way. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. My wife Margaret died on November 14th, 2 years ago. She was 68. She had been fighting ovarian cancer for 4 years, the kind of fight that is not dramatic in the way movies make it look, but grinding, exhausting, full of small indignities and occasional windows of normalcy that you cling to like life preservers. For those 4 years, I was her caregiver. I learned to administer medications, to adjust her pillows in the exact configuration that made her comfortable, to cook the 4 or 5 things she could still eat without nausea, to time her days around her energy levels. I learned to read her face. I learned to sit in silence with her in a way I had never learned in 40 years of marriage, because when there was nothing to fix and nothing to say, silence was the most loving thing I had. When she died, I was holding her hand. Both boys were there. Daniel, our eldest, who is 44 now and lives 20 minutes from me with his wife Sandra and their 2 kids. And our younger son, Paul, who is 40, unmarried, lives in Portland, and flew in 3 days before the end because I called him and told him it was time. The funeral was on a Saturday. Over 200 people came. Margaret was the kind of woman who made an impression, not through force, but through genuine interest in people. She remembered names. She remembered children's birthdays. She sent handwritten notes. In a world that has largely abandoned the handwritten note, Margaret kept writing them until her hands were too weak. After the funeral, after everyone left, I sat in the kitchen alone and thought, now what? I want to be honest about what the first year looked like, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. The first year was the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than building a business. Harder, in some ways, than watching Margaret be sick, because at least then I had purpose. I had a role. I was the caregiver. The provider. The steady one. After she died, I had no role. I was just an old man in a house full of her things, waking up on her side of the bed by accident, reaching for her in the night. Cooking for one, which sounds like a small thing but is actually quietly devastating. Watching the oak tree in the backyard go through all 4 seasons without her. Daniel checked in. He called on Sundays, usually. Sometimes he would come over with Sandra and the grandkids, Lily, who is 9, and Marcus, who is 6, and those visits were the best parts of my weeks. I love those children with something that feels cellular. Lily has Margaret's eyes. Marcus has her laugh. But I noticed things. Small things that I stored away without fully examining. I noticed that Daniel's Sunday calls became bi-weekly. Then monthly. I told myself he was busy, he runs a mid-sized logistics company, he works hard, he has a family. I understood. I noticed that when he did visit, Sandra spent most of the time on her phone, or redirecting the conversation toward themselves, their renovations, their vacation plans, a disagreement she was having with her sister. I told myself she was just self-absorbed in the way many people are, not malicious. I noticed that when I mentioned feeling lonely, Daniel would say, "Dad, you should join a seniors group, they have great activities," which is a very efficient way of suggesting that your loneliness is someone else's responsibility to solve. Paul called more often, actually. Long calls, sometimes an hour. Paul has always been the more emotionally available of the two, which I say not as judgment of Daniel but as simple observation. Paul asked how I was actually doing. He asked about memories of Margaret. He asked what I was eating, what I was reading, whether I had seen the neighbor's dog that I'd mentioned once, 6 months earlier, that I had grown fond of. But Paul was far away. And broke, honestly. Paul is a musician, a genuinely talented one, who teaches guitar lessons and plays in 2 bands and lives the life of someone who chose meaning over money, which I have always respected even when it worried me. So the loneliness was real. The isolation was real. And underneath it, something else was growing, a question I was almost afraid to ask myself directly. Do my children see me as a person? Or do they see me as an obligation? The question became impossible to ignore at Thanksgiving, 14 months after Margaret died. Daniel hosted. His house is large, they bought it 4 years ago, a colonial in a good suburb with a kitchen that seats 12. Sandra had cooked, which I appreciated. I brought 2 pies, Margaret's recipes, which I had carefully attempted to replicate and which were, I think, approximately 80% as good as hers. There were 9 of us at the table. Daniel and Sandra. Their 2 kids. Sandra's parents, who I had met perhaps a dozen times over the years, pleasant people, her father a retired dentist, her mother a former schoolteacher. Sandra's sister and her husband. And me. I want to be careful here not to be uncharitable. I know family gatherings are complicated. I know in-laws create dynamics. I am not someone who needs to be the center of the room. But I am going to tell you what happened, factually, and let you draw your own conclusions. At dinner, Sandra's father, Gerald, sat at the head of the table. Not the end closest to the kitchen, where Daniel had been sitting. The head. I noticed this but said nothing. During dinner, Gerald and Sandra's mother dominated the conversation. Cheerfully, not aggressively, they are gregarious people. They talked about a cruise they were planning, about their golf league, about a neighbor's house renovation. Daniel participated enthusiastically. Sandra laughed a lot. I spoke 3 times during the 2-hour dinner. I know it was 3 because I counted, the way you count things when you are sitting in a room where you are present but not quite included. The first time, I mentioned that Margaret used to make a sweet potato dish with a particular spice combination that was different from Sandra's, and wondered aloud if anyone wanted the recipe. Sandra smiled politely and changed the subject. The second time, I answered a direct question from Marcus, my 6-year-old grandson, who asked me if I knew any magic tricks. I did one, a simple card trick Margaret's father had taught me 60 years ago. Marcus was delighted. No one else at the table was particularly interested. The third time, I started to tell a brief story about Daniel as a boy, something funny, something warm, triggered by a conversation that had touched on childhood. Daniel laughed, briefly. Sandra checked her phone. After dinner, while the adults moved to the living room, I offered to help clean up. Sandra said, "Oh, Robert, you're a guest, go sit down." Guest. In my son's house, 14 months after burying my wife, on the holiday she had loved most. Guest. I sat down. Sandra's parents joined me and made polite conversation for a few minutes before gravitating back toward their daughter. I sat with Lily, who showed me drawings she had made at school. That was the best part of the evening. I drove home at 8 p.m., before dessert, because I had a headache I didn't want to admit was mostly sadness. In the car, I asked myself the question directly for the first time. When I am gone, truly gone, not just grieving and quiet in a house full of a dead woman's things, what will my absence mean to Daniel? Will it be grief? Or will it be logistics? I didn't answer it that night. But the question didn't go away. The idea came to me slowly, over the following weeks. I am not proud of every aspect of it. I want to say that clearly. It was a deception, and deceptions carry costs even when they are motivated by something genuine. But I also believe that some truths can only be found in the dark. Some people will only show you who they really are when the stakes are real. And the only way to make the stakes feel real was to make them real, or at least, believable. In February, I told Daniel I hadn't been feeling well. This was partially true. I had been having some fatigue, which my doctor attributed to mild anemia, easily managed with diet adjustments. Nothing serious. But I leaned into it. I told Daniel I was getting some tests done. He said, "Okay, Dad, keep me posted." He did not offer to come to any appointments. He did not ask for the name of the doctor. He said, "Keep me posted," the way you say keep me posted about a situation that is probably fine and someone else's problem. 3 weeks later, I told him the tests had come back with some concerns. That the doctors were running more specific panels. That I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but that I wanted him to know. His response was genuine concern, his voice shifted, he asked some questions. Good questions. I felt a small pang of guilt. But I kept going. In March, I told him that the results were not good. That the doctors had found something and were still assessing, but that the prognosis was, quote, not encouraging. I did not specify an illness. I kept it vague in the way people keep real medical news vague when they are frightened and processing. This vagueness, I suspected, would be more convincing than any specific lie. Daniel said, "Dad. I'm so sorry. What can I do?" I said, "Nothing yet. Let me get through the next round of appointments. I'll know more soon." I waited. What I was waiting for was the unobserved moment. The phone call he made to Paul. The conversation he had with Sandra when he thought I wasn't listening. The behavior that would emerge when he believed I could not see him performing. Because that's the thing about watching how people treat you. They can control what they show you. They cannot always control what they show each other. It happened on a Saturday in late March. Daniel had invited me to lunch, his idea, which was notable, because it had been some time since plans had originated with him. Sandra had taken the kids to her parents for the weekend. It was just the two of us, which was also notable. He made pasta. We ate. We talked about sports, about his company, about a plumbing issue I had been dealing with. It was, genuinely, one of the nicest afternoons we'd had together in a long time. I felt the pang of guilt again, stronger this time. I wondered if I had misjudged him. I wondered if the illness narrative had simply reminded him to prioritize. After lunch, I said I needed to use the restroom. Instead of going upstairs to the guest bathroom, I went down the hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water first. That's when I heard him. He was on the phone. His voice was low, but the hallway has good acoustics. It's long and bare-floored, the way old colonials are. "Sandra, I'm telling you, it's serious. The doctor said maybe 3 months. We need to start figuring out the house situation." A pause. Her voice, I couldn't hear. "I don't know. I think we listed and split it down the middle with Paul. But we need to make sure the paperwork is clean before, you know." Before. Another pause. "No, he seems okay today. He doesn't want to talk about it much. You know how he is." I stood there. I counted to 10. I got my glass of water. I walked back to the living room. I sat down across from my son, who appeared 2 minutes later with a composed face and a warmth that I now understood differently. We watched a baseball game. I drove home. I sat in the kitchen for 2 hours in the dark. And then I thought very carefully about what I had actually heard. Not through my emotions, which were telling me to feel betrayed, but through my mind, which was telling me to be precise. What I had heard, my son, believing his father was dying, immediately calculating the property division. Immediately thinking about the house. Immediately working through the logistics with his wife before the man was even gone. What I had not heard, grief. Not in that conversation. Maybe it existed privately, in him, somewhere I couldn't access. But in that unobserved moment, the first instinct had been inventory. And that told me something. I wasn't sure yet exactly what it told me. But it told me something. Here is where the story becomes, for me, more important than a simple tale of betrayal. Because while I was watching Daniel, Paul was also responding to the news. And Paul called me the day after I had first told Daniel about the tests. He had clearly spoken to Daniel. His voice, when I answered, was tight in the way voices get when someone is trying not to show that they've been crying. He said, "Dad. Daniel told me. Tell me everything." I told him the same vague story. The tests, the concerns, the uncertainty. He said, "I'm coming." I told him he didn't need to do that. That I didn't know anything definitive yet. That he shouldn't disrupt his life. He said, "Dad. Stop. I'm coming." He drove, he doesn't like flying, 14 hours from Portland. He showed up on a Wednesday with a bag that suggested he was planning to stay for a while. He didn't ask about the house. He didn't ask about the will. He asked me what I needed. He sat with me in the kitchen the way I used to sit with Margaret in those final months, in the particular silence of someone who is genuinely present rather than physically nearby. He stayed for 10 days. During those 10 days, I watched my younger son carefully. I watched for the self-interest that I half expected to find, the angling, the subtle conversations about assets, the future planning I had heard from Daniel. I didn't find it. What I found instead was a man who reorganized my pantry, who drove me to a doctor's appointment I had fabricated and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours with a book, who cooked dinner every night and did the dishes without being asked, who fell asleep on my couch 3 nights running because he didn't want to sleep upstairs while I was going through this. On the 8th night, after dinner, he said something I will carry with me until I actually do have 3 months left. He said, "Dad, I know I haven't been around enough. I know Portland is far and I know I always think there's more time. I'm sorry for that. I'm going to do better. Whatever time there is, I'm going to do better." I almost told him the truth that night. I came very close. I didn't. Because I still needed to know one more thing. After Paul left and went back to Portland, I waited another 2 weeks. Then I called Daniel and told him the doctors had gotten the results of the final panel and wanted to meet with me, and that I was nervous and would appreciate it if he came with me. He agreed. He picked me up on a Thursday morning. In the car, he was kind, asking how I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether I needed anything at the house. It felt like the version of Daniel I remembered from before, attentive, warm, present. At the appointment, I had arranged to meet a friend of mine who works at a medical building and let me use his conference room. I came out after 20 minutes and told Daniel that the news was complicated. That the prognosis had shifted. That there was still uncertainty. He hugged me. A real hug, the kind he hasn't given me since he was a teenager. I stood there inside that hug from my eldest son and felt the extraordinary complexity of what I had set in motion. That evening, he invited me for dinner. Sandra was home. The kids were home. And this is the part one have thought about most in the months since. Sandra, that evening, was different. Not dramatically, she is not a dramatic person. But she was attentive in a way she hadn't been. She asked about my appetite, about my sleep. She had cooked a lamb dish she knew I liked, something she had made once years ago at Margaret's request and I had complimented. She had remembered that. After dinner, while Daniel took the kids upstairs for baths, Sandra and I sat at the kitchen table. And she said, with a directness I hadn't expected from her, "Robert, I want you to know that whatever happens, this is your home too." I mean that. I looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Sandra," I said. "I know I haven't always made that easy," she said. "I know that. I want to do better. Now. Here is where I have to be the most honest, most precise version of myself, because it would be very easy to dismiss this as performance, as motivated by inheritance or property, as meaningless words from someone who had been caught calculating. But I have been alive for 71 years, and I have looked at a lot of faces, and I have gotten reasonably good at distinguishing between performance and something genuine breaking through. And I genuinely think, that the fear of losing me had cracked something open in Sandra. Not created something from nothing. But cracked open something that was already there, something that had been closed off by years of subtle distancing and the defensive tendencies of someone who had never quite figured out how to belong to a family that wasn't her own. I didn't resolve this neatly in my mind. I still haven't. But I held it carefully. For weeks later, I asked both boys to meet me at the house. Paul drove down again, another 14 hours. Daniel came on a Sunday morning with Sandra, without the kids, which told me he understood this was serious. We sat in the living room, the same room where Margaret and I had spent 30 years of evenings, where the boys had opened Christmas presents, where we had all sat together after the funeral eating food that neighbors brought and not quite knowing what to say. I looked at my two sons. Paul, who looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. Daniel, who had his jaw set in the way he does when he's prepared for difficult news. I said, I need to tell you both something, and I need you to let me get through the whole thing before you respond. They nodded. I am not sick, I said. I never was. My last physical was excellent. Patterson told me I'm in better shape than men 15 years younger. The silence that followed was one of the longest of my life. I lied to you, I said. I told you I was sick, I told you there were tests, I built a story that wasn't true. And I did it because I needed to know something that I couldn't find out any other way. Paul's expression had moved through shock into something careful, listening. Daniel had gone very still. I told them about the loneliness. The Thanksgiving where I spoke 3 times. The way the Sunday calls had thinned. The conversation I had overheard in the hallway about the house. I told them everything, plainly, the way Margaret always said I should communicate, directly and without dramatics, just the facts of the thing. When I finished, I said, I am not telling you this to punish anyone. I am telling you this because I am 71 years old, and I might actually have 3 months left someday, and I needed to know who I would be facing that with. I needed to know what was real. Paul was the first to speak. He said, Dad. And then he didn't say anything else for a moment. He looked at the floor. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet. I understand why you did it, he said. I hate that you felt like you had to. But I understand. Daniel hadn't moved. His jaw was still set. And then something shifted in his face, not the simple release of emotion, not tears, but something harder. Something that looked like a man confronting something about himself that he had been successfully avoiding. He said, the house. I nodded. He put his hands over his face. Not for long, Daniel is not a man who lets himself be visibly undone for long. But long enough. I don't know what to say, Dad, he said. I don't have an excuse for that. I heard that you were sick and my mind went to logistics and I hate that about myself and I don't have an excuse. We sat with that for a while. Then I said, I'm not asking for an excuse. I'm asking for a conversation we've never had. About what this family is. About what it's going to be. We talked for 4 hours that Sunday. I learned things I hadn't known. I learned that Daniel carries a guilt about Margaret's death that he has never spoken aloud, a feeling that he hadn't been around enough in the last year of her illness, that he had left too much to me, that his busyness had been partly avoidance of something he didn't know how to face. And because he couldn't face the guilt, he had also been distancing from me, because I was the living reminder of it. That was not what I expected to hear. And it reframed a great deal. I learned that Sandra had come into our family feeling like an outsider from the very beginning, that Margaret, who I had always seen as warm and welcoming, had had very specific ideas about how Daniel's household should run, and had expressed those ideas in ways that Sandra had experienced as intrusion. Not maliciously, but persistently. And that Sandra's distancing from me had been, in part, a defensive residue of that dynamic. I did not entirely agree with Sandra's characterization of Margaret. But I believed that Sandra believed it. And I understood that grief and love are not objective things, and that two people can experience the same woman differently. I learned that Paul's distance from home had its own complicated roots, a feeling that Daniel had always been the real son in some way, the one who had stayed, built a conventional life, given us grandchildren, while Paul had gone his own way and always half expected to be found wanting. The Portland distance was partly geography, partly self-protection. None of this was what I had expected to find. I had expected something simpler. Greed, perhaps, or indifference, or the quiet contempt that some people develop for aging parents. I had been preparing myself for something that would give me permission to feel righteously hurt. What I found instead was a family full of unspoken things. Wounds that had never been properly tended. Distances that had grown in the dark, the way things grow in the dark, not through any one person's intention but through accumulated silence and assumption and the human habit of avoiding the conversations that matter most. I am writing this in September. It has been 5 months since that Sunday. Things are different. Not perfectly different. Life does not offer perfect transformations, only gradual, uneven ones. But different in ways that are real. Daniel calls every week without exception. Not always long calls, sometimes just 10 minutes. But consistent, in a way that tells me it's a choice he's making rather than an obligation he's servicing. He came to help me redo the garden in June. Margaret's garden, which I had been letting slide. He came on a Saturday with gloves and tools and we spent the whole day out there. He didn't say much about what we were doing in a symbolic sense. But he was there, and he worked beside me, and at the end of the day the garden looked like something again. Sandra has been to the house 3 times on her own, without Daniel, just stopping by. Once she brought food. Once she helped me with something on my computer that I couldn't figure out. Once she came and we just had coffee and talked about nothing particularly important for an hour. She is trying. I can see her trying. I am trying to meet her. Paul is coming for Christmas. He's already bought the ticket, which for Paul, a man who lives his financial life close to the edge, is a significant gesture. We speak twice a week. He is still in Portland. He is still playing music. He is still the version of himself he chose to be, which I have come to see not as a disappointment but as a kind of integrity. And me? I have been thinking, in these quiet months, about what I actually learned from this. Not what I confirmed, because some of what I suspected was confirmed, and that is what it is. But what I learned that I didn't already know. I learned that the people who love you are often failing you for reasons that have almost nothing to do with you. They are navigating their own guilts, their own fears, their own histories. This does not excuse the failing. But it changes what it means. I learned that the question, do they love me or do they see me as an obligation, is, in most cases, a false binary. Most people contain both. What determines which one surfaces is attention, the deliberate act of showing up, which most people do not do automatically but can do when prompted. When reminded. When the stakes become visible. I learned that fear of loss is one of the few things powerful enough to cut through the comfortable numbness of modern life and make people present again. I manufactured that fear, which I am not proud of. But I also watched it do something real. I watched it open doors that had been closed. I learned that Margaret knew something I had always only partially understood, that a family is not a static thing. It is a living thing that requires constant tending. She was the one who did the tending, quietly, persistently, the calls, the dinners, the handwritten notes, the conversations that kept the tissue of us together. When she died, the tending stopped. And without tending, living things decline. Now I am learning to be the one who tends. At 71. In the house she filled and the garden she planted and the family she held together with what I now understand was extraordinary, unrecognized effort. It is not a natural role for me. I am a man who built things, not a man who nurtured them. But I am learning. Slowly. Imperfectly. Margaret would have something to say about that, I'm sure. She would probably say, "Robert, it took you long enough." And she would be right. The oak tree in the backyard is going to be extraordinary this fall. I can already see it in the way the leaves are starting to turn, a deep amber at the edges, the kind of color that stops you. Lily noticed it when she was here last weekend. She stood in the backyard and looked up and said, "Grandpa, that tree is showing off." I laughed for the first time in a long time, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real, not the polite kind you produce in company. "It is," I said. "Your grandmother planted it the year we moved in. She always said it needed 40 years to really become itself." Lily thought about this seriously, the way 9-year-olds think about things that catch them. "That's a long time to wait," she said. "It is," I said. "But look at it now." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she slipped her hand into mine, small, warm, absolute, and we stood there together under the tree that took 40 years to become itself. And I thought, this is what the 3 months were for. Not the confrontation, not the revelations, not the complicated forensic examination of who loves me and how much. This moment, right here. The tree showing off. My granddaughter's hand in mine. The particular golden light of an afternoon in early fall. I am 71 years old. I am not sick. I may have 30 years left or I may have 3 months, that part was never mine to know, and never will be. But I know who will be with me. And I know why. And I know that whatever time is left, I intend to spend it tending.